Hello ladies and gentlemen, Willie here. Before Season of Mastery launched, there were many players asking for some form of class balance to take effect in addition to the updated raid mechanics. Having played 2 years of Classic all the way through with world buffs, the general feeling was that even with their removal there wouldn't be a significant change in the order of which classes will perform best overall. Blizzard even took the step of answering this on the forums, saying, "We've also heard the concerns that having increased health of raid bosses, this is especially focused on warriors and rogues being better on longer fights because they don't run out of mana. We're not insensitive to this concern, but our intention behind increasing the health of raid bosses is to make up for the better itemization on gear and improved talents provided by the 1.12 version of the game." Based on what we saw in Molten Core and Onyxia beta testing last week, groups that stack warriors and rogues seem to struggle more than groups that had a greater diversity of classes. We'll keep an eye on things though, we're open to further adjustments if needs be, and it turns out we're mistaken. And with some time having passed now and lots of guilds having cleared the content, I wanted to see if it's true. Is it Season of Mastery or Season of Meta? Okay, a few things first. We don't have the biggest sample size, and logs that we'll look at will be full clears of Molten Core, looking at only boss kills, not including trash. We're not including trash because it wasn't changed, and we're not including wipes because it just skew numbers a lot. Of course, there are so many variables. Do warriors have recklessness up for each cleave heavy fight, each individual player's gear, the RNG nature of boss mechanics, external buffs like power infusion, and so on. And I'd like to start off with two not so encouraging bits of news. Within the first 10 Molten Core clears in the world, only one of those guilds is Horde. In fact, the progress rankings look like the exact opposite of retail. Alliance is far more popular for raiding this time around. As expected, thanks to the Banana Boys, the Paladins are just kind of really good. Imagine if your totems were, instead of having to be constantly replaced, are just a passive aura and buffs that you can apply to your entire raid. This, along with Blessing of Kings, scaling melee classes really well, and Salvation, and if you're playing Alliance, as an extra bonus you also get to play the best race in the game. Well, apart from Alliance having AV queues now, yeah really, times have changed that much. AV is the entire ranking meta actually. I hear big servers have 1 million bracket caps. Thrilling PvP. Anyway, the other bit of less encouraging news is that between all the logs I've looked at, there are a grand total of 0 Rep Paladins, Boomkin, Shadow Priests, Enhancement, or Elemental Shamans. There are a few ferals, but they swap between off-tanking and DPSing, like half the warriors will be doing, just minus the doing the damage part. There were some priests that showed up as DPS, quote-unquote, but they were hybrid spec'd into Shadow Weaving to benefit the locks, only there for utility and healing. Every single raid had either 1 or 2 druids, between a roster of 40. Most of them were Restoration. This isn't sounding very different to me so far. So I went back to Classic to see if I could find anything to compare the damage stat page breakdown. Unfortunately, a no buffs category was not used till Phase 5, and even then, barely anybody bothered with it. They only have, for some reason, Phase 1 and Phase 2 combined. Melee of course scale harder with gear and world buffs. Regardless, let's take a look at the all percentile section. Melee, for Classic this is, we're very far ahead, with the hybrids being the least represented. Warriors and rogues being the most ahead, with warriors having the greatest amount of variance due to off-tanking, and recklessness being an instant I win button. Mages, surprisingly, had the most passes with just over 750,000. Swapping this image to the 95th percentile gives us a better impression overall, and I feel shows how powerful melee were by the end of Phase 2 with world buffs. So, how is Season of Mastery looking around the time of doing this? Well, it's a little more bare to say the least, but again, warriors are on top as predicted, rogues are second, there's just a bit more variance with them, with hunters, mages, and warlocks not really being all that far behind. Swapping to the 95th percentile again gives us a bit of a better picture and shows us that actually things are a lot more even than expected. Now, I know what you're seeing here. Feral Druid better than Mage? Question mark? I mean, look, if you want to go farm 10 crowd pummelers per raid to narrowly beat somebody pressing Frostbolt, you do you, but also there are vastly less Druid logs overall, meaning those getting raid spots are likely Feral veterans, and on a 95th percentile level, this kind of thing shows. I also managed to dig up the number of passes overall for hybrids. Keep in mind, this is for every Molten Core log in the world, including China. Similar to Classic, the other most mages by a lot with 4,510. Hunter, Rogue, Warrior, and Lock are all pretty well presented between the 2 and 3,000-ish mark. And then there's, well, quite the drop-off. We have 173 Feral Druids, 132 Shadow Priests, and you know what? From this point on, numbers get so low, I'm pretty sure Warcraft Logs has registered these as the wrong specs through some weird event happening. Let's have a bit of a guessing game with the last few. We have Rep Paladin, Balanced Druid, Elemental Shaman, and Enhancement Shaman. Surely there will be at least a decent number of people playing each of these specs. Making raids more difficult won't have enforced the meta that much more, right? Well, we have a total of 21 Rep Paladins, nice, 15 Laser Chickens who don't want to put on the blue dress and heal, and for some reason there's only one Enhancement and one Elemental Shaman. This can't be right. There can't literally be one of each Shaman DPS logged in the entire world, but yeah, there isn't exactly a lot. In fact, a surprise DPS class has beat both Shaman DPS specs combined, the very well-known Fire Mage coming with 11 logs somehow. Yes, the Fire Mage and Molten Core, more popular than Shaman DPSing. I see. Okay, so this is kind of memey, and I'm sure there are more hybrid DPS than this, but it paints a picture that you can get the impression of what people are playing and what people are bringing to raid, and it doesn't involve many of the not good specs. By the way, here's the healer representation in case you were curious. Around 800 to 900 Resto Shamans compared to over 2,000 Holy Palas. Tells you where the raiding scene is, doesn't it? Right, so people aren't playing different DPS classes at all, but are they bringing a different number? Are we seeing more ranged? Or is it still just stacked rogues and warriors? Well, let's take a look at some of the top 10 logs of all boss skills and have a look. And overall, I'd say yes. Some raids even go to the extent of stacking an extreme amount of ranged classes, particularly hunters and mages. Notably for hunters with their weapon Bloodseeker, which is in from day one, it's really easy to get prebis from winning one AV. Hunters have always been great with entry-level gear. Once they start getting some leaves to drop, they should pull ahead even more. Hunters were frequently near the top of overall damage as well, showing their power and how important ranged DPS is in the new Molten Core. Some raids had great performance from rogues and warriors still at this early stage, and more or less every player was using some gear obtained through AV ranking. More or less every single raid had overall more ranged DPS than melee as well. There are a bunch of fights in the new Molten Core which are just super melee unfriendly, such as Golemag, though at the start of Classic there was also more range being used at this point in time as well, so this isn't too much of a change. There was one guild in particular that used 3 Warlocks and they topped the DPS. Now this is actually something different. What gives here? Well, a few things. One, if you want to do solid DPS, you can't be on curse duty. This means 3 Warlocks for Shadows, Elements and Recklessness are always going to be kind of middle of the pack. All 3 Warlocks here were using Agony and Doom, and as far as I could tell, this was the only raid that actually enabled their locks to succeed, through having a healing priest go into a hybrid spec for shadow vulnerability, adding a massive 15% more shadow damage taken on boss encounters. So overall then, how are things? Is it really season of meta, or have the changes made any actual impact? Well, it's different, but not by much. We are seeing more range being used on average, even compared to what top guilds did early on in Classic. For instance, here's Ape's world first roster, disregard the priests, they're all healers. If you threw some debuffs up, Warcraft logs can get confused. They're using 13 ranged and 14 melee. Progress, world second, ignore the priests again, 16 ranged, 12 melee. So not an unreasonable split. What has changed is the distribution of DPS. There is much more hunter and mage at the top of the meters, and I think warlocks have the potential to be higher too, but 3 of them will just be stuck on debuff duty and be average, and you need a priest to either run a full-on shadow or a scuffed healing spec. As for the meme specs, it's just not happening, never has, never will. They need buffs, not much more to say. It's not that people aren't bringing them, nobody's playing them either really. More so than Classic, surprisingly. It's still early days, as I said, maybe I'll revisit this later. Melee scaling will pick up shortly, and we're going to start seeing rank 14s appearing pretty soon. And that's about it then, more or less what I expected. Let me know what you think and how you've been doing so far in the raids if you've given it a go. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in. I shall see you all in the next one very soon.